So hello and welcome to Magazzino da Casa. My name is Teresa Kittler and I am the 2020-2021 Scholar in Residence at Magazzino Italian Art, the museum and research centre dedicated to advancing the scholarship and public appreciation of post-war and contemporary Italian art in the United States. And I'm thrilled to finally be here in Cold Spring. As a non-profit museum, now in its 4th year, it has been advocating for and celebrating the work of Italian artists from Arte Povera to the present. Today marks the beginning of our annual lecture series, which is now in its 3rd year. And these have explored new directions in the scholarship and research on post-war Italian art. This year, the series turns its attention to friendships and partnerships within Arte Povera, to consider to what extent collaboration forms part of the narrative of artistic practice and production in Italy in the post-war period. And this is really an open question, and I'm very much looking forward to reflecting on it over the next 4 talks. I've been particularly interested in considering whether it's possible to think beyond the trope of the Muse when addressing the contribution of women as partners in the work of this period, and how dialogue and exchange visibly shaped the work of otherwise well-known male figures. Organising this series has also been the result of much collaboration with my colleagues here at Magazzino, and I would like to thank them all for their support in putting this together. And a special thanks to Alex Theodoropoulos, Eve Aron, Carolina Koinowska, Juliette Vincente, and of course Magazzino's director, Vittorio Calabrese. The lectures will run on alternate Saturdays through to May the 1st, and you can find out more about each event, including dates and times on Magazzino's website, Magazzino da Casa. Each lecture will last around 45 minutes, and will be followed by a Q&A session, to which I encourage you all to participate with comments or questions, and you can do so by signing in and using the chat function during the talk. It is a real pleasure to introduce the first lecture today, which will be given by Professor Lucia Re, a scholar whose work I have become familiar with and much admired for the best part of 2 decades now. Her lecture is titled The Power of Two: Intergender Dialogue, Couples and Creative Partnerships in 20th Century Italian Culture. And this talk really frames the rest of the series by examining some of its key themes across the 20th century. Through literary and artistic examples. And her paper will reflect on the way in which women fought against traditionally subordinate roles and the age-old paradigms of woman as muse on the one hand, and of Pygmalion as the artist, creator and educator of women on the other. And Re will examine how women writers and artists found ways to challenge and subvert these restrictive male roles, sometimes together with men. Lucia Re earned her PhD in comparative literature at Yale University. She is research professor of Italian and gender studies at UCLA, and her principal fields are modern and contemporary Italian literature and culture. Re's interests are wide-ranging, and to list just a handful include poetry and the novel, women writers and artists, feminist theory and criticism, modernism, futurism, Italy and the Mediterranean, and literary translation. Her book, Calvino and the Age of Neorealism, won the 1992 Mararo Prize of the Modern Language Association. Her edition of Amelia Rosselli's volume of poetry, War Variations, which was translated by Paul Vangelisti, was awarded the 2006 PEN USA Literary Translation Award, as well as the Flaiano Prize for International Italian Studies. And Professor Re has published a staggering number of scholarly articles and essays, too many to list here, but including on authors and artists ranging from Gabriele D'Annunzio and Filippo Tommaso Marinetti to Benedetta Cappa, Eva Cuna Mendola, Paolo Mazzino, and Carla Lonzi. She has translated into English works by Rosa Rosa and Dacia Maraino. Her study of Marisa Merz appeared in the volume edited by Connie Butler in conjunction with the 2017 Merz retrospective at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and the Met Brewer in New York. Her most recent essays have featured in the Handbook of International Futurism, published in 2019, in California Italian Studies, also in 2019, and La Grande Iguana, Scenari e visioni a 20 anni dalla morte di Anna Maria Ortese of 2020. So we are thrilled to have you here, Lucia, and without further ado, I hand over to you to share your screen and
thank you.
Your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, happy first day of spring, everyone. I hope it's not too cold spring in New York and wherever else you are. I hope it's a wonderful day. Thank you so much for inviting me. I will start with a brief introduction, and then my talk will be divided into 3 parts. Part 1 is entitled Pygmalion and the Muse. Part 2 is entitled From Pygmalion to the Androgyne. And part 3, Futurist and Bohemian Couples. I will conclude by briefly mentioning contemporary artist couples whose members were born in the 1960s. Now for the introduction. Creativity scholars have recently been arguing that the lone genius is a myth that has outlived its usefulness, and that a more truthful model is emerging, the creative network, or perhaps the real heart of creativity, the intimate exchange of the creative couple. Literary scholars have explored the theme of literary couplings in order to explore the construction of authorship and how creativity functions in writing couples and collaborators. For example, Laura Riding and Robert Graves, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and so on. The essays in this volume, Literary Couplings, place famous authors in new contexts, reassessing overlooked members of writing partners and throwing new light on texts marginalized due to their collaborative nature. The theme of the creative art couple has also been receiving attention with scholarly conferences such as Beyond Genius and Muse at the University of Bristol in 2017, exhibitions and studies considering how examining collaborating couples can help us rethink the paradigms of working relationship in the arts, and questions such as whether couples collaborated or hindered each other, and how feminism, gender theories, queer studies, and other interdisciplinary methodologies can help shift perceptions and reconsider hidden power relations and intimate connections. The 2018 exhibition at the Centre Pompidou, Metz, and then at London's Barbican, entitled Modern Couples, that's the image you see on the right, the poster for this exhibition, intimacy and the avant-garde, consider couples such as Dora Maar and Pablo Picasso, Camille Claudel and Auguste Rodin, Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, Natalie Clifford Barney and Romaine Brooks, Sonia Delaunay and Robert Delaunay, Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, George O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, and many others, including lesser-known queer, transgender, and biracial relationships. The show aimed to challenge the traditional idea of the male genius and his muse. The curators sought to show how female artists were equally engaged and influential, sometimes even turning their male partners into muses themselves. But the show is also criticized by some for, I quote, using rose-tinted romanticism that neglected to investigate properly the emotional abuse or power imbalances that plagued some of the pairings, end quote. Indeed, in my own research, I found that creative couples' relationships are still often represented and read simply as intriguing love stories. Feminist scholarship over the last decades has successfully deconstructed and dismantled the myth of the male genius. I'm thinking in particular of the influential work of the British philosopher Christine Battersby, Gender and Genius, discover you see here. She and others have demonstrated how the notion of genius is a gendered myth that becomes especially dominant in the Romantic era. Rather than declining at the end of the 20th century, the genius idea continues to shape notions of creativity even today, especially in connection in the 20th century with the development of modernism, which strongly celebrated individual male artists as heroes in an alienated world, as well as a cult of originality and unique individual talent. In his influential 1906 book on gender difference entitled Sex and Character, Otto Weininger simply stated, I quote, "A female genius is a contradiction in terms, for genius is simply intensified, perfectly developed, universally conscious maleness," end quote. The same text, Sex and Character, was also influential in spreading the notion of the woman of genius as abnormal or hermaphroditic. Even today, genius as normative cultural hero is mostly definitely male. In manifold ways, it continues to promote its multiple forms of bias against women. The genius myth, in fact, operates by imposing a sense of male superiority and female inferiority. It affects the reception of women's work negatively by imposing itself on the very process of artistic evaluation to constantly affirm its own bias of female inferiority. Indeed, as Battersby has noted, I quote, "Once one starts listening and watching out for the word genius, even today, it is soon noticeable how much work this word and concept still do in description and evaluation of cultural achievement. Even those who have given up using the word often still cling to the old assumptions about genius in the way they talk, write, and think about creativity." This is certainly true of Italian culture. The word genius, for example, genio or genio ribelle, is often associated in the 1960s and 1970s with the Arte Povera artist Pino Pascali, for example, as you see from these two images. In Italy, even the figure of the art critic and art promoter often takes on the status and reputation of genius. Examples include the eternally opposed antagonistic geniuses, Germano Celant and Achille Bonito-Oliva, each of whom in turn deployed the rhetoric of the male genius along with the apparently, at least initially as in Futurism, all-male band of geniuses to promote the avant-garde groups that they helped create, Arte Povera and Transavanguardia, respectively. Individual members of those all-male groups, such as Enzo Cucchi of the Transavanguardia, could in turn be associated internationally as geniuses with other male artists, as in the 1989 book Il genio differente dell'arte contemporanea by Bonito Oliva. The essay manifesto by Germano Celant entitled Arte Povera, Notes for a Guerrilla War, published in Art Forum in 1967, made no mention of Marisa Merz, nor was she or any other woman included in Celant's initial Arte Povera book. And artists such as Maria Lai, to mention just one, may have been legitimately seen as part of the Arte Povera aesthetic, especially, for example, for her telai or looms from the early to mid 1960s. The discovery and recognition of the importance of Marisa Merz, initially seen as the artist's wife or muse of Mario Merz, and a marginal affiliate of the Arte Povera avant-garde, owes a lot, as Celant later recognized, to the new awareness triggered by the feminist movement and women artists and critics starting in the 1970s. Indeed, the role and presence of women or in near Arte Povera, and especially the importance of collaboration with female partners in the process of creating Arte Povera itself, has now become an object of scholarly inquiry, starting with the research undertaken by Teresa Kittler and this lecture series here at Magazzino. In Italy, as Giovanna Zapperi pointed out in the 2019 issue of the journal Sesti, entitled Yet Who is a Genius? Women's Art and Criticism in Post-War Italy, Carla Lonzi's idea of male protagonism in the Manifesto of Rivolta Femminile encapsulated a wider critique of the mythical apparatus surrounding the artist's figure. Feminist separatism and all-women autocoscienza groups were an important strategy at the time to overcome what the Italian artist Simona Weller, in a famous feminist book from 1976 that included hundreds of short essays, statements, and interviews with women artists, termed the Michelangelo complex. And you see the cover of that book here on the right. Although women fought to move beyond traditionally subordinate roles, the age-old paradigms of woman as muse on the one hand, and of Pygmalion as the artist, creator, educator of woman on the other, remain powerful and pervasive in Italy well into the 20th century. Yet, even while operating largely within these restrictive male paradigms, women writers and artists found ways to challenge and subvert them, sometimes together with men. Although these took different forms, dialogues across the gender divide and collaboration within artist couples nonetheless continued to foster both male and female creativity in ways that are yet to be fully explored and understood, and that may require rethinking conventional definitions of aesthetic production. And now I turn to part one of my talk. That was the end of my introduction. Part one is entitled Pygmalion and the Muse. The most famous example of creative couple at the turn of the 20th century in Italy is the tormented liaison of Eleonora Duse with Gabriele D'Annunzio, fictionalized in his 1900 novel, Il Fuoco, translated either as The Flame or The Flame of Life, and romanticized in numerous biographical accounts. D'Annunzio started writing for the theater after he met Duse. Their liaison lasted 7 years, during which he wrote 8 plays, and together they pursued the dream of a modern Mediterranean theater. Duse became D'Annunzio's collaborator, lover, and principal international interpreter, as well as generous financer. She also took it upon herself to look after all the practical aspects of the play's staging. In the Ode to the Divine Eleonora Duse, the poem solemnly placed at the beginning of Francesca da Rimini, the play in which she starred and that she also produced, D'Annunzio attributes to the actress not only the role of an inspirational muse, but also that of an essential emblem of the innovative power of art. But Duse was, for D'Annunzio, much more than a muse in the traditional sense of the word. She was a determinant factor in his theatrical vocation, and it was through her that D'Annunzio became acquainted with the theater and the stage as a semiotic system. D'Annunzio continued to venerate Duse until his death. In his study at the Vittoriale, was his last residence, he wrote in front of her portrait and marble head by the sculptor Minerbi, but he kept that head covered with a veil. But D'Annunzio had an agonistic relationship with Duse, aimed at minimizing her influence in the public's and perhaps his own eyes. He tried to contain her energy while making it his own. He especially resisted the threatening originality of her interpretations and sought to obfuscate these interpretations in various ways. According to witnesses, in fact, Duse's technique and interpretive inventiveness and her internationally understood style of acting by using her body and facial mimicry could overshadow the language of the texts, sometimes eclipsing them completely. D'Annunzio's dramas and the novel Il Fuoco can be read as symptoms of the agonistic dialectic between the poet and the diva. His affirmation in the theater seemed to require that the mythical Duse became subjugated in her roles, making her symbolically subordinate to the author's authority. During rehearsals, D'Annunzio tried to replace her in her usual directorial role by giving the most detailed and pedantic stage directions in the history of the Italian theater. The tendency towards self-annihilation, almost appearance, became the actress's new stylistic mode in her D'Annunzian roles. And the characters of D'Annunzio that he created for Duse are under the sign of mutilation. In the play La Gioconda, Silvia, played by Duse, is married to a sculptor and sacrifices her hands in order to save one of his statues from destruction. Duse thus became symbolically disabled on stage, deprived of the famous expressive hands that represented the quintessence of her technique. In a sadistic variation and inversion of the Pygmalion myth, in the last act, Duse, famous for being able to communicate with even the slightest movements of her body and with her voice reduced to an intense whisper, was literally immobilized like a statue, reduced to being a completely mute presence at the back of the stage. The character of the divine actress Foscarina in the novel Il Fuoco is surely the greatest role D'Annunzio ever wrote for her. So much so that the novel contributed decisively to defining Duse's myth in the world. Nonetheless, the novel is centered on the attempt to reduce the actress to the role of a mere instrument, a means through which the masculine genius can be incarnated. Stellio is the artificer, the fire that forges life. He affirms the values of domination and of creation. She represents the feminine and passive values of submission, devotion, and sacrifice. In Il Fuoco, then, no trace remains of Duse's famous technique, of her interpretive and analytical genius, or of her intensively calculated style through which she created a hypnotic effect of depth, suffering, and empathy on the stage. In the second part of Il Fuoco, when he describes the way in which Stellio almost vampirically takes possession of Foscarina's art and pours it into the theatrical work he is conceiving, Stellio goes immediately from admiration of the actress to self-admiration. He strikes her violently and he's overtaken by the illusion that he has actually created the actress and given her life. Through the act of creation, he apprehends the power of the actress's body for himself, even though he's given female qualities that assimilate creation to procreation. In the novel, Stellio never loses his sadistic inclination. On the contrary, the text exalts his sadism and violence. Foscarina's desire for death and disappearance at the end of the novel, Il Fuoco, is but the ultimate and necessary consequence of this creation. By 1904, Duse, deeply disillusioned and financially in dire straits, was no longer willing to submit to D'Annunzio's wishes and ambitions, and she turned a new page. Although she kept D'Annunzio in her repertoire, she increasingly opted to play, for the most part, her beloved Ibsen. What is not well known about Duse is how much this experience contributed to nurture her self-reliance and her connection with other women. Through her acting, her letter writing, and her persona as a liberated professional and creative woman, Duse had considerable influence on intellectual women and established a complex web of often intimate female friendships between World War I and World War II that fostered a new sense of legitimacy for women's thought, women's creativity, and women's autonomous activities. Now to Marta Abba. One of Duse's closest friends and pupils was the performer Ofelia Mazzoni, who in turn influenced the great actress Marta Abba. Abba's relationship to the modernist writer Luigi Pirandello, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, has long been represented as that of his muse, following the same muse male genius archetypal myth I have already discussed. And although the theater by nature is perhaps more conducive to a reciprocal creative collaboration between partners than other art forms, Pirandello, in his relationship with Abba, effectively sought to reproduce the myth of Pygmalion and his muse once again, though he gave it a modernist spin. In his 1927 play, Diana e la Tuda, Pirandello's dark and unhappy Pygmalion, the sculptor Sirio Dossi, marries his beautiful model, but he has abandoned all dreams of authentic living creation, and their relationship is a dismal failure. Yet, ironically, as we know from their extensive published correspondence, in his relationship with Abba, for whom this play and many others were written over a period of 10 years, Pirandello himself was incapable of looking beyond the myth of the muse and the Pygmalion paradigm. He loved her absolutely, he declared, but wished to keep total control on her whole life. She was his one and only source of inspiration, he claimed. A single breath from her could make him live and write again. But he was never able to look at her and treat her as the real artist that she was, to have a sodalizio or equal partnership with her and collaboration with her. He wrote to her obsessively and used emotional blackmail and manipulative language in a compulsive manner to make her his exclusive creature. When they first met in 1905, she was 24 and he was 58. He was married, but his wife was mentally ill and continued to, confined to an asylum since 1919. Although Abba and Pirandello's relationship may have been platonic, we don't really know, Abba was in fact entirely devoted to Pirandello for 10 years until his death. Yet during their time together, he insisted on keeping her in a subordinate role, and as if she indeed were his own creation, as if he alone were responsible for her greatness on the stage, for giving her the gift of language in the theater and of life itself as an artist. Abba, however, was like Duse, highly aware of her own artistic ability and of acting as a form of creation. In an article published in 1931, she wrote with an obvious ironic allusion to the myth of Pygmalion. The poet makes art out of words. The sculptor uses marble. The painter, color. The musician, notes and instruments. The actress makes art out of herself alone. She's the instrument of her own inner music. She is the one who sculpts herself, the one who models herself in her own clay. the dialogue with Pirandello unquestionably allowed Abba to develop her creative genius as performer, it was through the constant dialogue with her in the lived experience of writing for the stage, making the play come to life through many rehearsals, rewrites, and changes, that Pirandello developed and nourished his theatrical ideas and his plays, so that she must surely be seen to a large extent as Pirandello's co-author. And now to another theatrical couple, Dario Fo and Franca Rame, another famous later creative couple of the Italian stage. They share their domestic as well their theatrical life. They were married in 1954, and their son Jacopo was born in 1955. Their theatrical troupe, Dario Fo, Franca Rame, was active from 1958 and became hugely successful, truly writing an important chapter of the history of political theater in Italy through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Franca came from a theatrical family and the Commedia dell'arte tradition, and she was practically born on the stage. The particular nature of the couple's theater made her contribution as performer, financial manager, and critical interlocutor for her husband on a daily basis absolutely essential to their work and international success. The gender roles and expectations so deeply entrenched in fascist Italy and the myths of Pygmalion and the superiority of the male genius continued to be operative implicitly or explicitly in Italy long after the fall of fascism and through most of the 1960s. For years, Rame was seen only as Fo's wife, helpmate, and secondary member of the couple, while he was clearly celebrated as the one who was the genius. Even Rame's feminist stage monologues of the early 1970s, Tutta casa, letto e chiesa, when first published, were at first attributed to Fo alone. Only in later editions were they officially acknowledged on the front cover to be co-authored by the couple. Now, most editions of all the plays, even those initially attributed to Fo alone, like Mistero Buffo, have both names. It was by developing a feminist sensibility in the context of the wider and diverse phenomenon of Italian feminism in the 1970s that Rame herself began to understand and reevaluate her role within the couple, and indeed to her husband rid himself of his maschilismo. Machismo, in fact, became the target of many of their joint satires for the stage. In interviews and other texts, Fo acknowledged her essential contribution not only to their domestic life, but to the very process of theatrical creation, writing, I quote, "The two of us did everything together." The originality and power of their work was truly an example of what I have called the power of two. When in 1997, Fo received the Nobel Prize for Literature, which unlike other prizes has never been given to a couple, in his official acceptance speech, Fo elaborated on why the prize shone to Franca too, and declared that in fact he shared the honor equally with her. This Nobel for Two in turn became the basis for a documentary on the couple, and the couple also became the subject of a rare joint intellectual biography, specifically as an art couple, coppia d'arte. Now for part 2 of my talk, from Pygmalion to the androgyne. In the realm of literature and art, the male genius Pygmalion myths was no less pervasive and influential than in the theater. It was a myth that feminist women who did not buy into the even more insidious myth of genius as sexless or genderless sometimes sought to overcome by adopting and adapting for themselves another mythology, that of the androgyne, or even of the hermaphrodite, a cultural phenomenon among intellectual women well known across literature and the arts in other European cultures. Examples include Virginia Woolf, Valentine de Saint-Point, and Hannah Hoch. One of the first women in Italian culture to embrace the androgyne was a writer who eventually became a feminist icon, Sibilla Aleramo, the author of the international bestseller Una Donna, A Woman, an autobiographical novel published in 1906. She too initially believed in the prevalent myth of the genius as male. A famous anonymous photograph that you see here on the left shows her as a young woman in her studio with images of art by Michelangelo and Rodin pinned to the wall behind her, and postcard portraits of Dante and Michelangelo on her desk. But in contrast to the prevalent ideology, she soon developed the belief that a genius could be a man or a woman as long as this individual had and cultivated an androgynous mind. In the right-hand image here, you can see an older Sibilla Aleramo at her desk with, on the wall behind her, one of the portraits of Aleramo herself painted by her friend, Leonetta Cecchi Pieraccini, and this one dates from 1928. In this slide, you see the same portrait next to an earlier portrait of Aleramo, painted by the same artist, the friend of Aleramo, Leonetta Cecchi Pieraccini, in 1915. The androgyne was historically an intellectual possibility afforded only to men. Female androgyny, on the other hand, was viewed as an attempt to overthrow the natural order and continue generally to be associated through the first half of the 20th century with natural, failed womanhood and either the monstrosity of the hermaphrodite or the sterility of the neuter. But Aleramo's androgyne was not the old Arco myth of wholeness and coexistence of contraries or fusion of genders whereby one sex is enhanced and completed by the other. Intellectual androgyny for her became a strategy to transcend the rigid binary opposition that constrained the female experience and fixed prescriptive norms and gender roles for women. It was, we could say, a way to generate within herself the power of two, the reciprocal and dialogical power of the creative couple in mutual conversation. Throughout her life, Aleramo also felt her creativity in writing was enhanced by being in a love couple, platonic or otherwise. She had relationships, for example, with the poet Giovanni Cena, the futurist artist Umberto Boccioni, and the lesbian poet Lina Poletti. These relationships were often nurtured through love letters or letter writing in general, and always involved mutual reflections on creativity and art, certainly in the case of the very rich exchange of correspondence between Aleramo and Lina Poletti. The new feminist myth of the androgyne endured well into the later 20th century, and we find variations of it even in the work of women artists and writers of the 1970s, such as Marisa Volpi, for example, Lucia Marcucci, who wrote a famous essay called The Guerriero Androgino, and Tommaso Binga. Tommaso Binga is the male pseudonym, or rather the androgynous signature, adopted by Bianca Minna, author of the 1977 satirical performance piece entitled Oggi Cose, which entailed the fictitious marriage between herself as Bianca Minna and herself in male drag as her spouse, Tommaso Binga, of which this double-framed photographic self-portrait by the artist was a component. This was a playful, ironic way to defy the stereotyped binary gender ideology of patriarchy that still informed the institutions of the art world in the 1970s. And now part 3, futurists and bohemian couples. Although male bonding and the homosocial band of brothers remained more or less implicitly constants of avant-garde creativity in Italy, from futurism to the trans-avant-garde, and all the way to the booming fiction writing collective in the 1990s. This is one of the images with which they represent themselves. We know their names and we know they're all men. This is a collective that is intentionally faceless, but distinctly male, as it is composed of 5 men. Futurism was the first avant-garde movement in Italy to open to women during and after World War I. Here you see a slide of Marinetti standing on the right with the editorial board of l'Italia Futurista, with one of the most famous futurist couples, which I circled in color, Maria Ginanni and her husband next to her. The idea of a primacy of the male genius remained undiscussed, yet with the deep change in gender roles brought by the war, the word genius appeared more and more often in connection with the work of creative women, especially in the wartime journal, l'Italia Futurista, whose editor was, for a time, the writer Maria Ginanni, married to the futurist painter and filmmaker, wonderful painter and filmmaker, Arnaldo Ginna. The most famous creative couple of futurism between the war, however, is certainly that formed by Marinetti himself, the creator of futurism, and his wife, the futurist writer and painter Benedetta. Benedetta belonged to a generation of Italian women who benefited from the social, sexual, and cultural upheavals caused by the war. Women once confined to the home and deprived of any substantial education or cultural formation other than basic literacy were suddenly allowed to enter the public sphere and engage in a number of traditionally male activities, including experimental art. Benedetta's generation was uniquely fortunate, however, for fascism would soon stifle the liberating impetus generated by the First World War by regimenting sexuality through the exclusive paradigm of the exemplary wife and mother, deriding as sexual deviants women artists and intellectuals who had the ambition to compete with men in arts and letters. In addition to her 3 major experimental novels and her own body of painting, which included in 1933 the unusually large-scale works for the post office in Palermo entitled Synthesis of Communications. You see them in the next 4 slides. And the black and white images are historic photos of the artists from the work, with the work, sorry. And this next one, you see on the right, the 2 of their 3 daughters, of the Marinetti 3 daughters. Benedetta, who had 3 daughters with Marinetti, collaborated with her husband in the creation of a new futurist art form known as tactilism. Tile boards, for example, the one you see here, Paris, Sudan, which includes, among other things, a cheese grater, sponges, pieces of fur, velvet. They were assemblages not to be experienced through visual contemplation or analysis, but by touch, through the direct tactile perception of the art object in its material constitution. Benedetta also collaborated with Marinetti in the production and staging of a number of works for the theater. She influenced his thinking and work in multiple ways, and he always treated her and presented her as his equal. She became a lifelong collaborator who in the 1920s and 1930s helped shape new developments in futurist sensibility and aesthetics, especially the more abstract, spiritual, and celestial vein of aerial painting, or aeropittura, as you see. This is one of Benedetta's well-known aeropitture. Benedetta's views represented a radical departure from the early futurist position, which dismissed women, denounced marriage, and reduced heterosexual love to sex and procreation. She elaborated a vision that contested the futurist one-sex model and instead exalted femininity, motherhood, and female creativity. However, by 1926, the fascist backlash against the new woman and anti-female discriminatory policies determined the outlines of a regressive agenda for women, who from now on were required, for the most part, to be patriotic wives and subservient prolific mothers, and to devote themselves to family life, nursing, or children-related work, thus sacrificing any other need, tendency, or desire. The impulse to fashion through artistic creation and experimentation new and more modern roles for women on an equal basis with men was effectively also stifled by fascism. Nonetheless, Benedetta sought and was able to strike a compromise between the exigencies of the regime, which she supported along with Marinetti all the way to the end, and her work as a writer and as an artist. She created a successful persona for herself as an exemplary fascist wife and mother, and simultaneously, in truly futurist fashion, a creator whose power was nourished by the mutual and equal relationship with her husband. Between the wars, the most well-known, even notorious artist couple was that of Mario Maffei and Antonietta Raphael, who had a relationship of passionate competition and reciprocal support. Extroverted and self-confident, Raphael was not raised in Italy, and this may account for her unconventionality. She was a Jewish immigrant from Lithuania who had studied music and art in Paris and London before settling in Rome and becoming the partner of the painter Mario Maffei, with whom she had 3 children before the couple married in 1935. In spite of the burden of childbearing and rearing, in the 1920s, she began a career as a painter, inspired by her husband, who was in turn soon strongly inspired by her work, especially her use of expressionist, vibrant colors. Living a bohemian life, Tonietta and Mario were able to be both artists and share or take turns in the work of raising a family, thus define the gender roles and expectations of the fascist era. They painted portraits of each other. However, their life together was marked by conflict and long interruptions. She was alone when she had their first child in 1926. Maffei was indolent and melancholy and perennially undecided. She encouraged him in his work, but also demanded that he face familiar responsibilities and establish a home for the family. The critic Roberto Longhi noticed the originality of Raphael's work in 1929 and considered her a key member, along with her husband and the painter Scipione, of what he named the School of Via Cavour, from the street where the couple lived in Rome. Scholars have shown that both male painters were influenced by her painting style, but neither of the male painters was ready to acknowledge this. Maffei greatly valued his intimate friendship with Scipione and their joint bohemian escapades around Rome's slums. Scipione saw Raphael as an enchantress, a kind of maid or witch who had seduced her friend. This is a famous painting by Scipione, Risveglio della bionda sirena, the awakening of the blonde siren. The blonde siren is Maffei, clearly. The competitiveness with her husband, and especially the homosocial bond between him and Scipione, were a source of tension, which soon led Raphael to pursue sculpture instead of painting in an effort to avoid further conflict. It is interesting to note parenthetically that Scipione in his painting was obsessed with pairs and couples, and that both he and Raphael were interested in the myth of the hermaphrodite. And here you see the drawing by Scipione from 1931. Both are small works, the Scipione drawing, ink drawing, and the Hermafrodito is a very small sculpture by Raphael. Raphael was very disciplined in her own art and very independent, sometimes spending long periods abroad in London and Paris in the early 1930s, and often leaving Mario and his mother to take care of the children. He encouraged her even from afar, however, helping her to overcome obstacles that she encountered in her work. Raphael often chose archetypal strong women and biblical females as subjects for her sculptures, highlighting the strength, sexuality, and power of the maternal body in ways that hardly conformed the regime's expectations of femininity. The couple left Rome in 1938 after the promulgation of the racial laws to live in hiding, first in Tuscany and then in Genoa. There, and over the years of their marriage, she always found domestic arrangements, spaces, and ways to concentrate on her sculpture rather than on domestic chores. But while Maffei's reputation grew in the 1930s, she, like most women artists, was excluded from the more important shows and exhibitions in fascist Italy. Only after the war and her separation from Maffei, who pursued other relationships, she became one of very few women to gain respect and admiration in Italy as a sculptor. However, the two, Maffei and Raphael, continued to exhibit together occasionally and shared a political sympathy for the Communist Party, though not for the party's cultural practices or policies, I should say. They never stopped having a passionate arguments about art. After Maffei's death in 1965, Raphael started painting again, as well as continuing to work on her sculpture until her death in 1975. And now I come to my brief conclusion. I had originally intended to discuss, but unfortunately do not have time now, one more influential artist couple, Edita and Mario Broglio, founders of the journal Valori Plastici, and two literary couples, Massimo Bontempelli and Paola Masino, and Alberto Moravia and Elsa Morante. And finally, the interracial couple in post-World War II Italy, Rome, I should say, Win Demby and Lucia Demby, both fiction writers who also collaborated on several film projects, including the 1962 film Congo Vivo. My discussion will be in the written version of this talk, but in the meantime, I would like to conclude by just mentioning some of the younger artist couples, mostly installation, performance, and video artists born in the 1960s in Italy that have more recently embraced dual collaboration as the very structural principle for their joint work. In other words, they just work together. These are Botto and Bruno. This is how they call themselves as artists. Cuoghi and Corsello, and Bianco Valente. I just chose these three, but there are more. Botto and Bruno, Cuoghi, Corsello, Bianco Valente, each in their own way, these new younger artist couples are using the power of two to help reconfigure in new ways the traditional notion of creativity, previously assumed to be fundamentally based on the individual genius. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lucia, for that really rich paper. and very evocative. It was also serendipitous that you ended at the historical moment that our subsequent lectures will take off from. So it really set the scene for the case studies of figures within Arte Povera really very well. I wanted to start off the questions by asking you to say a little bit more about the fascinating reference to the circle of female friendships that Duse cultivated or nurtured in the period before the first, before World War One.
Yes, that's a very interesting, I have to say, it's an interesting new field of inquiry because it really has developed only in the last few years and in mostly thanks to the work of the people at the archive, the Duse and Aleramo archive, the Cini Foundation. And that's where I discovered, really, they were there, obviously, but I discovered that these letters existed, that these collaborations were real. And there have been in the last few years a few books by feminist scholars about women's friendships, intellectual friendships. And now we're learning more and more about how many of these friendships are also intimate friendships or lesbian affairs and friendships. So Duse is very much still the object of inquiry and study at the moment, but certainly a lot of the actresses that worked with her or that admired her wrote memoirs in which you find very clear allusions to how influential the connection with her was for them. And so how friendship, even though it might not have been a romantic friendship, women's friendships really were important in the intellectual formation of women at that moment in history. And of course, they became very important again later in the Arte Povera period, certainly, and with Rivolta Femminile and the Autocoscienza groups, they were absolutely essential for the development of Italian feminism after American feminism, because that's where the idea really got started. But so this feminine links, these female connections, we didn't really know about them in the earlier part of the century, and that's what's really opening up new vistas for research. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, Lucia. So anyone that would like to participate and comment, please do so through the chat function. We have a first question, which I'd like to put to you from our audience. Can you comment a bit more on the place of anonymous experiments, not only Wu Ming, but also Oulipo and others in this collaborative paradigm? Does the couple belong to the disappearance of the subject, Foucault, and genius, or is it something else?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the whole talk that I don't think the couple counts in the disappearing subject category. But the fact is that feminist scholars don't believe in the disappearance of the subject, and that it's it has been an interesting category, especially in post-structuralist thought, but I think it's no longer that useful. It's certainly never been really useful for feminism. Oulipo and Wu Ming are very interesting collective groups, but they are also in a way very limited. First of all, Oulipo was not anonymous. Was a a group that was all men, and they met regularly, and everybody knew who they were. They just called themselves Oulipo. But Wu Ming is more interesting because Wu Ming actually writes collaboratively. In other words, they they each write a piece of the novel, and then they share what they've written, and they collaborate on the editing process. Sometimes not very well, frankly, but it's an interesting experiment. It was very interesting in the 1990s, and however, it's interesting the way they write, and the themes they choose are very much in symphony with the male avant-garde syndrome, in a way. So there would be we could discuss a long time the significance of more interesting perhaps is to wonder about Elena Ferrante, because no one knows who she really is, but I think I've figured out that she is a couple. She's a collaborating couple. So it would be interesting to try to figure out why the couple hidden behind the name of a woman in this case.
Thank you so much. So another question. I'm interested in this phenomenon of the new woman in Italy in the 1920s. Is this influence and influx of international publications and ideas into Italy at this time, or are there other factors that contribute to this phenomenon, the phenomenon of the new woman in Italy in the 20s?
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, definitely. There is an influx of interest in, especially there always was really international feminism in Italy already from the late 19th century, in the very early 20th century. There is a very strong feminist movement in Italy, and there is a suffragist movement in Italy that is connected with the English and German feminist movement. So feminism in Italy has a first wave and a second wave, just like about everywhere else. But the phenomenon of the woman is connected in particular to the war, to World War I, and that's when it really develops strong in Italy. It's futurist women such as Rosa Rosà, who I have translated. She was not Italian by birth. She became Italian. She became one of the most interesting examples of the ideas or the intellectual development of the new woman in Italy. So the answer, I guess, is yes and no. It's both a phenomenon that is connected to an international opening of Italy, very connected to the gender roles that changed so much during World War I.
Thank you. Another question. So in addition to the artists you mentioned in the conclusion, I wonder what you make of gendered female collectives that are intergender in demographic. So the example given is Claire Fontaine, specifically Fulvia Carnevale and James Thornhill. And you also obviously mentioned the literary example of Elena Ferrante.
Yeah, they're very interesting. I really wish I had a good answer for you. I don't really know the work of these collectives very well. So I'm intrigued by what they're doing, but I'm not sure. I know there is a couple of female Italian female photographers who have done something very interesting. They have shared their archives, and they've recently, well, maybe not a couple of years ago, or maybe last year, they've done a show together, and they not only share their archives, but also they superimpose photos on each other's work. So they actually are doing something that looks kind of like surrealist, kind of like surrealism. And so they're also inspired by an earlier surrealist gay couple, a couple of women that was in the exhibition of at the Barbican. So I mean, what's interesting is that I think there are all these experimental forms of trying to create together and use a way of creating that is not necessarily relying on the single individual. Not because I don't believe the single individual can create by him or herself, but that, I think there are other forms of creativity that are very interesting, that are connected to 2 or 3 or 4 or more.
And we have another question that's asking about your possible further reflections on the relationship of Tommaso Pinga, Bianca Pucciarelli Menna, and her husband, the critic Filiberto Menna. So this question is asking how this might complicate the work that you showed us, Tommaso Pinga's Oggi Sposa.
Yes, that is a very good question. I've asked myself that question. It's interesting because there's so much irony at play there. I haven't really done a lot of research on Tommaso Pinga, but Via Bottinelli is the Pinga expert. So maybe this question we can ask her to answer that question, because she really knows a lot more than I do. What I find intriguing is that the exhibition I just mentioned of the 2 young photographer, the couple, the 2 women who are sharing their archive, that has been done by the Tommaso Pinga Foundation. So Filippo Menna Foundation, excuse me. So it clearly there is an interest in couples there that resonates and continues.
I had another question. I'm interested in the way in which these dialogues and friendships and couples are registered in the work. And I was intrigued by a comment that you made early on in your lecture about Duse introducing D'Annunzio to the stage as a semiotic system. And I wondered what the effect of that acquaintance with, this notion of the stage as a semiotic system had on his work, or if it was, in what way it did, if it did.
Yes, it was very important. Thank you for that question. It was very important because D'Annunzio, he had never written for the theater before, though of course he knew the theater very well, and he was a huge fan of hers from before. D'Annunzio approached the theater from a literary perspective. He wrote this incredibly ornate and beautiful, but very difficult to stage. These works were very difficult to stage. So he learned what didn't work and what could work on stage. And at the Cini Foundation in Venice, which I had the luck to study at and to work at for a while, a few years ago, when one could do those things, they have Duse scripts. So the texts of the plays by D'Annunzio, and like almost half of the lines are erased because she basically thought you couldn't say that much on stage and play work. So she was kind of what you would call a dramaturg today. In other words, she explained to him how everything could work together, but it didn't have to all depend on on the written text, and not even on the spoken text. A lot had to be conveyed in these other, with these other signs that had to do with the body, had to do with costumes, the lights, the movement of the actors on the stage. And so he knew nothing about that. And even though he intuited it at some point, but he understood that if he wanted to be a theater person, he had to adjust to that system. So I think that also too, I mean, the way in which actors work with playwrights is also fascinating in general, I think, but also actors. I mean, there is a wonderful movie, Malcolm and Marie. I don't know if anyone has seen that, but even in filmmaking, Malcolm and Marie, and it's a one of this Hollywood's great preferred genres, the meta movie. Malcolm and Marie, he's a director, she's the actress, and of course she's the muse and he's the genius. And the movie, this brilliant movie, is about the night after the opening of the movie. There is a incredible fight between the two of them because she points out to him she's the actress, but she wasn't starred in the movie, but she was the muse. She says, well, why didn't you say at least thank you for my contribution and contribution? So even in filmmaking, sometimes the relationship between men and women in the making of a movie, and especially the creative contribution of the partner or the actress, or sometimes both, is not acknowledged.
Thank you so much for that. So I just wanted to say that it was Silvia Bottinelli who asked you the question about Tommaso Binga, and
okay,
Silvia doesn't mind. Well, sorry, Lucia. I was just saying, I hope Silvia doesn't mind me mentioning that she'll be giving a paper as part of a panel on women drafts, drafts women in Italy in the 20th century in a couple of weeks' time, as part of a conference that's taking place at the Demonil. We have 3 more questions, and I think then that will take us to the end of our session. So the first one is, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the new feminist myth of the androgyne in relationship to Marisa Volpi. This is a really interesting question.
Yes. In her case, I think the issue arose in connection with Carla Lonzi. And Carla Lonzi, at that time, when she started Rivolta Femminile, and she had separated from her consagra, the great sculptor, and she really strongly believed in the need for female separatism and for women to be together to talk and discuss issues of creativity and feminism in general. And I think her great friend Marisa Volpi had a different view of art, and she had a different reading of the androgyne altogether, which was more along the lines of great art is really neither male nor female. Great art is, she really basically meant genderless. That's what she meant. That she, in other words, in my reading of her use of that myth or that figure, what she really meant was that I'm an artist, or people are artists, and they're not either male or female. An artist is an artist, doesn't matter. The sex doesn't matter. The gender and the sex don't matter. So it might as well be an androgyne. I don't know, is that clear? In other words, the androgyne was not like Sibilla Leramo's androgyne. That, not at all, because Sibilla Leramo was very, very interested in writing, developing a style that, yes, the androgyne mind, the femininity was very much for her an important, crucial component for her writing. She would never have said that a great artist. So I guess it's just a different way of reading that myth, but myth can be read in many different ways.
Perhaps given the time, I'll just pose this last question from the audience to you. can you comment a bit more on the role that the male art, but also theatre and literary critic may have had in Italy in promoting only the male half of the couple?
Well, I mean, the history of Italian art speaks for itself in a way. I mean, it's one of the more disturbing aspects of the history of Italian art, especially in the post-war period. Very often the work of great women art critics is just taken for granted, and they're not transformed into these superhero figures. I don't know, people like Lea Vergine, for example. I mean, I can think of any number of women critics who did a lot of great work and did not become this genius figure. So it's interesting. It's really, I think Christine Battersby really is right. I think the work of myth, the work of the myth of genius, the myth of Pygmalion, is so enduring that we conform to these cultural patterns, even unconsciously, today. And certainly the tendency to think of avant-garde groups as only male groups, or to think of influential critics as only male critics, is all too familiar in the Italian tradition, and even the more recent one.
Do we have time for one more question, perhaps? Is that all right with you, Lucia? Yeah.
Sure.
So we have a question from an audience member that says that they're interested in your opinion on broken creative couples. So, for example, Carla Lonzi and Pietro Consacra, but I mean, we can also think about Carla Lonzi with Carla Accardi, and how the phenomenon of separatism complicates thinking about creative couples in post-68 Italy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to the future presenters of this series answer those questions. Okay. No, not because I don't want to engage with this question. I very much do, but I think it's like opening a very big issue that has to do with the really, it's at the heart way of what you're doing, Teresa, and the series. So it's a very good question. Obviously, there are a lot of power plays that go on. Carla Accardi Consagra, her diary, the beautiful Vai Pure. I mean, one could talk endlessly about what happened there. And Boetti and Sozo Boetti, the before and after their union. It's a really very complex. I mean, it's a beautiful. I can provide any.
No, absolutely, and I think that's a very good place to end. So yeah, can I just remind you all to please join us for our next lecture, which actually reflects a little bit further on Carla Lonzi, and the lecture Mutually Impressed and Distanced, Luciano Fabbro's Creative Collaborations with Women, will be given by Dr. Sharon Hecker on April the 3rd at 12 p.m. As I mentioned, and as you'll read on Magazzino's website, it's the first of the 3 case studies focusing on the many themes outlined by Lucia Re, but looking specifically at Arte Povera. So all that remains to be said is a huge thank you to you, Lucia, for starting the series off so wonderfully. I know not all of the audience members' questions have been answered, and Lucia has very generously invited anyone that does have further questions to write to her by email, and you can find her email address on her departmental webpage. So Lucia, thank you so much. And yeah, that was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you everyone at Magazzino. It was really wonderful. This is a great series. I'm so happy to have been the one to start this, and I look forward very much to the other talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much.